Welcome to Tell Sleepy Stories, bedtime stories from the past, a place where you can learn about history and slowly drift to sleep. Tonight, we travel back to the 14th century to discover what people used to eat and why you probably wouldn't want to try it yourself. Imagine this. You're standing in a small European village on a cold morning in the 14th century. There are no cars, no phones, no noise from the modern world, only the wind brushing through thatched roofs and the faint smell of wood smoke drifting through the frozen air. The dirt road beneath your feet is uneven and muddy, with deep footprints frozen from the night before. Somewhere in the distance, a cow moos softly, and a farmer crouches beside a small fire preparing for a long day that begins with breakfast. But breakfast in this time is nothing like what we know today. No coffee, no toast, no eggs sizzling on a pan. Just a piece of hard, dark bread, and a few sips of thin, weak beer to wash it down. That's how a new day began. Quiet, cold, but familiar. The 14th century was an age of fear and survival. Plague, war, and hunger made every meal precious. A crust of bread, a piece of cheese, that could be enough to bring someone a moment of happiness. If you look around, you'd see life slowly moving on. Children playing by the roadside, a woman stirring a pot of thin soup over the fire, and ribbons of smoke curling above the rooftops. But beneath that quiet peace, there's a harsh truth. Eating in the 14th century was a struggle, not just because of scarcity but because it was dangerous. Without refrigerators, without any real preservation, food spoiled quickly, sometimes within a day or two. And in that harshness, food became a mirror of society itself. The rich feasted on dishes spiced with pepper and cinnamon, not for taste but to hide the rot. The poor survived on black bread and watery broth, just enough to keep breathing through another cold night. So tonight, as you listen to this story, let your mind drift back in time, to a world where having anything to eat was reason enough to be grateful. Take a deep breath, and imagine sitting beside a flickering fire, your hands warmed by the flames, and before you, a meal from centuries past, simple, smoky, and flavoured with the will to survive. The meal of the rich. As night falls over the cold stone castles inside, candles flicker to life, casting soft light across long white tablecloths. Silver cups, golden knives, crystal goblets, they all glimmer faintly in the candlelight. Music drifts from one corner of the room, and nobles enter slowly, wrapped in perfume, velvet, and polite conversation. The feast begins. Servants march in line, carrying great platters of meat, roasted pork, venison, swan, even peacock. Each dish is buried in spices, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg. But the scent isn't just for flavour, it's to hide the smell of decay. Without ice or refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly, and the only way to make it edible was to drown it in the power of spice and smoke. The lords and ladies sit upright, but they don't eat much. In the 14th century, a feast wasn't meant to fill the stomach. It was meant to display power. Dishes shaped like dragons or birds, animals stuffed with grains and honey, painted in gold or dusted with sugar. They were made to impress, not to enjoy. While the music plays, a storyteller recites tales of battle. A poet praises the king, and the food slowly cools on the table. No one really cares about taste. They care about where they sit, whose cup is made of gold, and who is served the rarest dish. That was the world of the rich, a world of luxury, of overpowering spice, and of meals that existed not to be eaten, but to be seen. The meal of the poor. Beyond the stone walls and shining halls of the nobility, life for ordinary people moved quietly. There were no banquets, no glowing candles, only small wooden houses with straw roofs and thin smoke rising from their chimneys, fading into the pale morning mist. The peasants' day began early. They didn't have much to eat. Breakfast was a piece of hard, dark bread, sometimes dipped into thin vegetable soup, or rubbed with a trace of leftover fat from yesterday. No meat, no fresh milk, and if they were lucky, a small piece of cheese to share with the whole family. Bread was essential, but not the kind we know today. It was made from barley, oats, or rye ground roughly, dense and dry, sometimes mixed with husk or bits of sand. They ate it every day, so often that they called it the meat of the poor. The next most common dish was soup, a pot of boiling water with a few wild greens, sometimes an onion or a small carrot. In winter, when vegetables were scarce, They added dry beans or roots just to feel a little more full. Meat was a luxury, a rare gift that appeared only during festivals or when someone slaughtered an old animal. Then the whole village would share it, each person receiving a small, precious piece. That memory could last for weeks. There were no individual plates, no forks or spoons. The family gathered around a single pot, using wooden ladles or their bare hands. Children waited for the adults to finish before scraping up the last bits from the bottom. It was a simple life, poor but connected. They didn't know luxury, but they understood sharing. A hard loaf of bread, a pot of thin soup, enough to bring warmth into their long, cold nights. And when evening came, they sat together by the fire, eating the last of their meal, listening to the wind outside. For them, a meal wasn't about pleasure. It was about gratitude for simply having something to eat, spoiled food, and how they preserved it. In the 14th century, keeping food from spoiling was a daily battle. There were no refrigerators, no ice, and during the hot summer days, everything spoiled quickly, turning sour, growing mould, and filling the air with a faint rotten smell. To them it was normal. Old food wasn't thrown away. Nothing could be wasted. Instead, they tried to save it in any way they could, with salt, smoke, vinegar, or by boiling it again and again until the smell disappeared. Meat was packed in barrels of salt. The thick salt drew out all the moisture, leaving the meat dry and tough as wood. When it was needed, they soaked it in water for hours, then boiled it until it softened. Yet the salty, sour, and bitter taste never truly left. It was the familiar taste of poverty. Fish, especially herring and cod, was the lifeline of medieval Europe. It too was salted or smoked, hung above the hearth to dry, then eaten piece by piece through the long winter. Sometimes the fish grew so hard that people had to strike it with a hammer before cooking. Vegetables were dried in the sun, or pickled in vinegar to survive the harsh seasons. They were stored in wooden barrels or clay jars, covered with layers of salt or beeswax to keep the air out. But not everything lasted. In summer, salt melted, flies multiplied, and rats found their way into the grain. People still ate what they had, because hunger was worse than any bad taste. Sometimes mould, sourness, and bitterness blended together, but in the midst of hunger, that mix became the flavour of survival. They grew used to it, to tough meat, dry fish, hard bread, and strange-smelling soup. They ate in silence, waiting for harvest season, when the scent of fresh food would once again fill their homes. The feast of the nobles. While peasants struggled with hard bread and thin soup, behind the heavy doors of stone castles, another world unfolded, a world of candlelight and music, of golden platters and endless feasts that could last for hours, or even days. For nobles, a feast wasn't just about eating. It was a display of power, wealth, and refinement. Long tables were covered in white linen, and dozens of dishes were laid out. Roasted pork, lamb, pheasants, even peacocks and swans, their feathers restored, their skin brushed with gold leaf. They ate with their hands, but gracefully. Each lord had a servant standing behind him, offering napkins, pouring wine, and replacing plates when food turned cold. The air was filled with scent: honey, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, rare spices brought from the east, worth more than gold. Sweet soups laced with honey, roasted meats dusted with cinnamon, and thick red wine served in silver cups. Yet behind all that splendour lay something less elegant: hygiene. There were no personal forks or knives. Meat was torn by hand and cups were shared among guests. Hands were rinsed in rosewater, then dipped again into half-cooked meat. Sometimes the feast ended with a few guests quietly falling ill, but no one spoke of it. Under candlelight everything looked perfect, and the host's smile mattered more than the truth. Music played on, maids danced in the firelight, and laughter mixed with the clinking of goblets. The feast went on until the last candle died, leaving behind the smell of wine, roasted meat, and the heavy breath of a satisfied, weary night. Strange dining habits and table etiquette. For nobles, a meal was not just eating, it was ceremony. Every gesture, every bite was a reflection of status and upbringing. Sitting down was an act of hierarchy. The highest-ranking guest sat at the centre, under the brightest candlelight, where all eyes could see. Servants stood behind each person, ready to pour wine, wipe hands, and serve food with silver knives. No one began before the host, and when the host stopped, everyone stopped, even if the plates were still full. Forks, as we know them today, barely existed. People used large knives to cut meat, then picked it up with their hands or with a piece of bread. That same bread served as a plate, soaking up grease and sauce. When the feast ended, those greasy plates were given to the poor waiting outside. Chewing loudly was forbidden. Laughing with food in your mouth was shameful. If someone sneezed, they turned away and whispered a small prayer, for it was believed the soul could escape in that moment. The rules were many and strange. One must never lick the knife, even if it dripped with delicious sauce, for that was considered savage behaviour. And when dining with a lady, a gentleman was expected to offer her the best bite, even if he himself was starving. Wine was poured into a single shared cup, passed from hand to hand, each person drinking from the same spot. Not out of affection, but as a symbol of trust. Those feasts were both refined and peculiar. Among the music and flickering candles, medieval people ate with grace and restraint, in a world where manners were sacred, and hunger was always quietly waiting beneath the surface. Spices and strange delicacies. The wealthy had access to lavish feasts and exotic spices. Spices were expensive, and sometimes they were used to cover the smell of food that was not entirely fresh. Royal dishes could include rare birds, undercooked fish, or even organs. Luxury was not always about taste, it was about status and survival. What they ate might shock us, but it was a mark of privilege. Seasonal and local limitations. Food changed with the seasons. In winter, meals were meagre, root vegetables, stale bread, maybe a bit of preserved meat. Summer brought fresh fruits, grains, and herbs, but preservation was crude. Sometimes fresh-looking food hid bacteria or mold. People had to eat what was available, often hoping it wouldn't make them sick. Health risks of eating in the 14th century. Foodborne illness was common. People suffered from infections, parasites, and poisoning. Some were visible dangers, like spoiled meat. Others were hidden, invisible threats. Eating was not always about enjoyment. Every meal could be a gamble, and survival often depended on luck as much as care or skill. Why we should be grateful today. Thinking about food in the 14th century helps us appreciate our modern kitchens. Clean water, refrigeration, and careful food preparation make meals almost effortless. We no longer need to fear every bite. Every safe, warm meal is a gift, a luxury our ancestors could hardly imagine. Centuries ago, eating was a challenge, not a pleasure. From peasant bread to royal feasts, every bite was a test of survival. Tonight, as you drift to sleep, remember the strange and sometimes dangerous culinary world of the 14th century, and take comfort in your warm, safe, and delicious modern meals.